Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. What is happening at a local shopping center might provide a clear view into the future of retail as the industry is in turmoil. Developments present, contemporary, and distant are a part of our theme tonight as we look at the reemergence of the former site of the Iberville housing development and at a fire 100 years ago this week that had a devastating effect on local theater. We'll also be looking at the massive gunfire incident on Canal Street and the search for a cause, as well as new laws governing carnival parade routes. All of this, plus our Future Watch segment, which peers into what to expect during the first 2 months of the new year, are on the list for tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jessica Williams, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. I'm going to go over to Errol first, and Clearview Shopping Center is going to get a new look.
Yeah, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina a few weeks ago, and there was a Target a few blocks from the hotel, and we asked instructors how to get there. And when we found it, we didn't recognize it because if those of us who are used to Target in terms of what we see at Clearview as being part of a sprawling shopping center, this was part of a complex that almost looked kind of hospital-like in terms of here was a Target, here was a building, here were some apartments, here was office buildings. So this is a different type of environment than what you've seen department stores before. And this seems to be the future because all over the nation, with a few exceptions like Lakeside, developers of these shopping centers are really in trouble because of the internet and people ordering things from Federal Express and all these deliveries, and so their business is declining severely. And so there's been a lot of hunting. I mean, what's the way for the future in terms of doing this? And so I think what you see is going to happen at Clearview. They're talking about they're going to have a hotel there, an apartment complex, recreation facilities, doctors, medical complexes. And so I think that's what it's going to be. But, the thought is kind of like the irony here is that if you look at retail shopping, originated in city after city, it was downtown where you had this cluster of buildings, including hotels and apartments and doctors' offices. And then they moved to the suburbs, I guess, in the 60s. And now with this change, essentially, they're creating
little cities.
They're creating mini cities around buildings, and so it's almost going back to what it was in smaller groups. And so
walkable scale.
Yeah.
A place where you can eat and shop and live and play, and that's what, when we talked a couple months ago to the Jefferson Parish Economic Development folks, they said Lakeside's truly an anomaly, but both Clearview and Elmwood are going to see that model of residential, retail, office all together. That's the way they will survive.
If you walk through Clearview today, it's rather sad. It's almost shocking. The food court, I think, only has one place. That's the Chinese place. And now they do have the movie theater complex. Okay, they do have a couple of restaurants like Semolina's.
And then, of course, Bed Bath & Beyond and Target are there.
And they do have Target, and so there is
and some restaurants.
There is still good reason to go there, but you can't help saying, hey, I remember when this used to be there.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot that's missing from what it was, and so it's time for a redo.
Of course, Sears used to be there.
Well, of course.
And so what's going to happen with that big
Of course, that's the big thing. And part of the problem was that the Sears was owned separately from the rest of Clearview. And so the developers now own that Sears land, and that's going to be incorporated. They've been talking about somehow splitting the Sears and having part of the pathway going through it with Sears. It could be more of an outdoors feeling and getting away from that indoors type feeling. And so Sears will be incorporated into it. But that's Sears was struggling to begin with, but when you took Sears away, that's a lot of foot traffic that you lost.
So it's opened up the outdoor space, which, of course, Lakeside, when it first opened all those many years ago, and I can remember when it first opened.
It was all outdoors.
All open there. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and Lakeside has had a lot of that grow up around it, even though it still is the mall. There are more strip walkable centers right adjacent to it. It's a whole, several blocks instead of just one building.
I have a question for you. So we hear about the demise of the shopping mall, yet when I go to Lakeside,
is an anomaly
there is
nationwide.
not a parking space to be found. So it doesn't seem that it's struggling.
Lakeside is not struggling. It's the only mall in our area that that isn't struggling.
With the demise of all the other malls, that's the go-to mall.
It has the world of shopping centers all to itself now.
Really, I mean, we're approaching now the holiday season. You really won't be able to find a parking space. I mean, you just
Can't
have to
in
travel.
good, non-holiday time.
Yeah, I know.
And it's been able to hold on to some good anchor stores. It still has the
Right.
Well, and it's gotten a much more high-end reputation lately too. Some of its stores are very high-end.
But back to Clearview, of course, some of the parades now are starting their route there at Clearview, and then also the Family Gras.
They sort of turned Mardi Gras around in Jefferson Parish in terms of the route of the parades, which used to start down toward the other end of Veterans, and now they're having it. Well, they're having it so they can end there, and so they can have the Family Gras celebration there, and trying to make that more of a parade hub, which also goes back to the urban tradition, okay, of having the celebrations down in the city. So essentially, you were creating little cities. I really thought to call it a city center. I mean, to actually use that word. Yeah.
Clearview City Center. So when are we going to see this happen? When is this evolution going to start?
Well, I think the evolution starts within the next year. It's probably a couple of years before we see the full thing. But
Okay. All righty. Jessica, over to you, because another change for what we used to call the Iberville Housing Project is now Bienville Basin, and it really has gone through a change too, with the assistance of some federal money.
Some federal money, also some tax credit money, also a lot of investments on the local level. And this is really in line with a model by the Housing Authority of New Orleans, in keeping with the federal government, to get away from what we could traditionally think of as the housing project. You know, these sort of super blocks, long identical rows of buildings that all face inward, and were really seen as sort of isolating and not inclusive. And what this development has done, and what really Hano has tried to do with all of its developments since the first one that was revamped in 2000, the former St. Thomas, now River Garden, is make it more of an open model, and having not just low-income families there, but families of mixed incomes, having the apartment buildings face the street, having instead of everyone at one site, folks being in the neighborhood in units that are connected to adjacent homes. And really in keeping with the mindset of, we don't want to segregate low-income families. We want to give them an opportunity to be included in the overall surrounding neighborhood.
So the federal program that did give some money to this, which helped boost the development, was from the Obama administration, was called Choice Neighborhoods, and it was more than just that actual housing space. It goes more into the community surrounding it, right?
That is the case. One of the criticisms of the initial federal program that was designed to replace the former housing developments is that it only focused on the building itself and not in revitalizing the often distressed neighborhoods that surrounded the building. And so for this project, the developers not only focused on the actual structure of the Iberville, they focused on spurring development outside of it, encouraging developers to build in the surrounding areas. The Jung Hotel, the investments that were made a couple blocks over in the medical arena with Tulane. A lot of these things were seen as, the Iberville project being the catalyst for. This was going to encourage more folks to come in, but it's also going to encourage development in the surrounding areas, which will in turn feed into the success of the project.
if you drive down like Washington Avenue and Martin Luther King, it looks like what seems to be a success. I mean, the areas look nice, and you see small businesses that are developing, and so the formula seems to be falling in place.
Definitely. There's a yoga studio there now. There's a coffee shop. Really, one of the things that also was included in the design was not only to have, a new opportunity for folks to live with, mixed income families or, with retail or adjacent to retail, but also an opportunity for them to be connected to case managers. Who could help them to go to job interviews on time, or to be, what is your plan for the next 5 years? Not only allowing you to have a pleasant environment while you are in government subsidized housing, but giving you a pathway to getting yourself out of that situation where you're more self-sufficient. And that was also one of the things that was baked into the program. So you'll see a learning lab on site where there's computers for residents to use. You'll see a daycare where children can go to school while parents are working, and the school is close to the home so that the parent doesn't have to be on public transportation for miles and hours and hours. And that was really baked into the program, and is one of the things that is considered to be a big success.
And of course, that Iberville, well now Bienville Basin, that location is just prime real estate. It's right next to the French Quarter, and in terms of transportation, you're just right there on it. You definitely are. And are all of the units, have they all been constructed, or are they still in the phase of constructing some more?
They're still in the phase of constructing. I believe the final phase, which was called the Winn-Dixie project at the former Winn-Dixie site nearby, by, it recently went to closing, and so there will be construction activity happening there soon. But overall, the project is substantially complete. I think we're at the 7th phase of the on-site development, and now they're just looking at developing all of the little apartment complexes off-site to really make it the true neighborhood revitalization that the program was designed to be.
And as you said, it's mixed income, so it's subsidized, market rate, but also workforce housing as well.
Right.
And that means for what? First responders, teachers?
First responders, teachers, folks who need to and who want to live in a centrally located area, but who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford the rent that would typically cost you to live on Canal Street.
And all of this was part of a big post-Katrina controversy. I remember there were some very angry council meetings with people protesting this.
For sure.
And to me, this is one of Ray Nagin's finest hours, in that he stood behind all this, as did the council, the entire council. And so a mayor and a council that were divided on just about everything else on this all stood together.
And Iberville was one of the last to be developed, and because of the choice real estate so close to the French Quarter and CBD, there was some of the fiercest protest that was going to be a land grab. But it really hasn't turned out to be that. There's a little less density than there was before. But
initially, yeah, there were protests. I think one of the proposals was to turn it into a stadium, to have it be where the Superdome is now, or not the Superdome, but the Pelicans Arena is now. That went away, and now what they did to try to head off some of that community opposition was really encourage community buy-in as the plans went out. Before anything was ever submitted to the federal government, you had a working group of residents who voted on what sort of redevelopment they would want to see, and that was one of the reasons why Iberville, once it was finally said and done, wasn't as controversial as some of the demolitions that we saw with the other housing projects.
All righty. Thanks a lot, Jessica. We're going to move over to Mike right now, talking about the Canal Street area, but further up, closer to the river. Big shooting incident last weekend.
Well, once again,
shaking your head.
Yeah, it's something that does pop up at these New Orleans events in and around the French Quarter and the densely packed Canal Street. In this case, after the Bayou Classic football game Saturday into early Sunday morning, a gunman or gunmen, police have not fully announced all of what they know, opened fire into a large crowd of people, almost 3:30 a.m., but still jam-packed, despite police covering the block and neighboring blocks. People pulled out guns, or at least one gunman, and 10 people wounded, all taken to the hospital. Only one remains hospitalized. That's the good news. Nobody died in this particular incident, but it's been a very active investigation since that happened. There are developments and leads that have yet to be announced publicly, but there was a pretty clear video from one of the surveillance cameras on a storefront that did capture the shooter, coming out with a handgun, firing away.
Right by a police car.
Yep,
the police car is right there at the curb.
What you don't see in that video and a couple other videos on the block that we were able to see, police weren't exactly on top of the shooter, but they do come running into the picture. But there had been some criticism of why police weren't able to corral the shooter more quickly. But if you look at the scene, it's chaotic, it's at night, people are running in all directions, including the officers, and gunfire is a tricky thing with echoes and ricochets, especially in a downtown area. You cannot pinpoint where shots are coming from.
And there was a lot of people that were running toward the officers as the officers were running toward the gunshots. And in the Herb reports, at first they thought that
That's right.
they were being fired upon, the police.
Simply because it was so close at hand. Why would anyone pull out a gun with police officers, in their line of sight? That officers thought, "Wow, are we the targets?" And nevertheless, sprung into action quickly. The positive of having so many officers on the scene is they were able to very quickly get to the wounded. Some tourniquets were applied that were possibly life-saving. Now, most of these wounds were to the extremities, but those are problematic with bleeding, and the fact that they were able to stop bleeding, get people quickly to a combination of University Medical Center and Tulane Medical Center. All lives were saved. There were only 2 people who underwent surgery. We know that one of those victims had been an athlete up in Baton Rouge. Heard from that family about the trauma of the experience. Now the attention really turns to the police investigation, which has really picked up some momentum. We're expecting some sort of news in relatively short order. The police have announced that this motive is thought to be a personal beef or feud, and that the gunman is not from the immediate metropolitan area, but somewhere else in Louisiana. And that is where the attention now has turned for detectives.
Once again, it just leaves you shaking your head in a situation like that. How do you prevent it?
Those are tough to prevent, simply because the mass, volume of people. It's not a controlled setting like walking into the Superdome or the Smoothie King Center. Through a metal detector, people are coming and going, free ingress and egress in the quarter. Now they have, stepped up some security measures. We have, of course, permanent presence of state police troopers, as we did, including some extra troopers for this particular event, knowing they're going to get massive crowds like they always do for Bayou Classic. But even that is not enough to prevent somebody from, bringing a gun. And in this case,
and this was on one of our major streets. The shooting actually happened on Canal, not on a quarter street. Let me get you to quickly touch on a story that you did a few weeks ago about insurance fraud scheme.
Well, yes, we had
Car
a
insurance.
series. It was originally 3 parts turned into 4, called Highway Robbery, focusing on what is staged accidents. Accidents actually intentionally caused by people who pack themselves in a car, ram into an 18-wheeler for the purpose of committing insurance fraud and filing bogus lawsuits and claiming, or at least exaggerating, injuries. It's been known within the trucking industry and among the defense attorneys representing those trucking industry and insurance companies, and the feds finally picked up on that. We had an initial federal indictment naming 5 defendants as being involved and orchestrating an accident that was caused by the people claiming they were hit. We had a superseding indictment just yesterday where 3 new defendants were added. And what was interesting in this superseding indictment, not necessarily 3 more of kind of the lower level players, people who packed into cars and claimed injuries and filed lawsuits, but you could see a roadmap to the rest of the investigation, which in my series I was able to detail and name the names of attorneys who are sort of in the investigation, being looked at very closely, as knowing about the scheme, participating in it, and those would be higher value targets for the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office than simply the people staging the accidents. A person can be involved in 1 or a couple of those, but an attorney could make a whole business over years and dozens of cases on phony accidents.
So the probe continues.
Big time.
Okay,
Big time.
thanks, Mike. Dawn, over to you. 2020, 2 first months, real busy.
You just said it, big time.
Yeah.
Very promising. Tourism and marketing folks in the city say the next 2 months, or the first 2 months of 2020 are very promising. And actually the last couple of weeks of 2019 are pretty promising too. There are a plethora of 49ers fans who have flooded the city this weekend. Hotels are almost sold out for this weekend. Then you've got the New Orleans Bowl on December 21st, and then the new year kicks off literally right away. We are a host city again for Dick Clark's New Year's Rocking Eve, so there's national coverage, live shots from New Orleans, fireworks over the river at midnight, and then the very next day is the Sugar Bowl, which will be which will be a matchup between the highest-ranked SEC team that is not going forward and the Big 12. So it's and likely teams that travel well and will come to the city for that. Then the very next weekend, you're looking at the first Saints playoff game. The Monday after that, you've got the College Football National Championship game. The weekend after that, you potentially have another Saints playoff game. It would be the Divisional Championship game. We hope that that's here. The Rock and Roll Marathon's February 8th. NOLA Rugby kicks off at the Shrine on Airline in February. and you've got Mardi Gras mixed in all of this. So it's a super promising first couple of months. The next 30 months, starting in January, are a bit of a downturn, not as robust as they have been in the last 7 and 8 years. And I'm told that Nashville and Austin, particularly those cities, are doing a very good job right now of marketing kind of the way New Orleans always has, and the music and the food and the culture and the festivals. So we might have to up our marketing game a little bit to stay on pace with where we are in January and February. But if you're looking to see New Orleans getting a national spotlight, you don't have to look far for the month of January and the month of February. The spotlight is definitely on our
And if
city.
there's a little thing about the Saints being in the Super Bowl.
Well, and if you remember, the last time the Saints were in the Super Bowl was in Miami. It is this year too. And more people came to New Orleans than went to Miami to experience the Super Bowl in New Orleans, even though the actual game was in Miami. And then there are big events as we go. The Women's Final Four is in April, Zurich Classic, Jazz Fest. So there's no shortage of that turnover of tourists. It just the first 2 months are truly crazy in a good way.
Crazy in a good way, real intense.
Once that dies down, there's a Superdome renovations, right?
Right.
Now, usually that's a kind of a marketing pitch to maybe bring a Super Bowl or some other major event. That's a multi.
That could be something that impacts, maybe not the next 30 months, but very shortly after that.
And then, of
Those
course,
architectural, renderings made it look like almost a whole new arena.
Well, I mean,
Exactly.
New Orleans generally always has something going, and that certainly this one something is Mardi Gras, as you referred to, and so there are going to be new rules and regs. Right,
There
Jessica?
are. The
Possibly.
city, the city council is looking at this idea of number one, banning plastic bags. We all know someone or have been hit in the head
Yes.
with a hefty pack of beads wrapped in plastic. So the crews would be, under the rules that the council is considering, the crews would be forbidden from just
the whole
lobbing
bag.
those off the float. You would have to unwrap all of your throws, take the plastic off, throw it in little bags on the float, or either unwrap it before you ever get on the float, with the idea of giving a little bit of a break to the city's sanitation crews who are faced with a sea of these bags every night, giving a break to the marching groups at the schools. The kids as they're marching are slipping on the plastic bags, and it's really becoming both a safety issue and also just you want the streets to look a little bit cleaner. And the city also is looking at a ban on toilet paper that's not biodegradable. So no more of those streamers that you would see coming off of the Tux float in different colors that just sort of hang on the trees for days and days and take forever to disintegrate. The city is saying no more to that. You would have to use only very thin toilet paper if toilet paper is your throw of choice. And then also no more RVs within 2 blocks of a parade route. And this is interesting because, there's always folks that come down, travel from all over to New Orleans and like to set up in their RVs, or either folks who live in the city and rent parking lots to set up there. They would not be allowed to do that. You would have to be 2 blocks from the route in order to come and enjoy the parade. Also restrictions around how many marching groups or dance troops can be in the parade. Only 1 between a float, and then only 12 at the start of the parade, no more than that. With the goal of shortening down some of these longer and longer parades that we've seen that last well into the night.
So this was a committee that
Yes.
passed these regs. It still has to go before the whole council.
It still has to go before the whole council, and already I'm hearing, some of the crews are open to it. They say that some of these rules are things that they've already sort of embraced in practice. There's some crews that are doing, entirely recyclable throws, not even plastic beads anymore, and they're very, welcome and open to these. Other groups say, this is going to be a little hard to enforce.
Especially if the rules kick in for this year. People have already purchased their throws.
That is the administration's
And
intent.
it is intended for 2020.
For 2020.
Okay, we'll see what council does then. When will they take it up then? It has to be
My
pretty soon.
understanding is it has to be pretty soon. They did not take it up at the most recent meeting. It was delayed to give folks a little bit more time to digest it. But my understanding is they are looking to have that passed before Mardi Gras 2020.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot, Jessica. We're going to wrap up with you. 100 years ago, a big fire in the
Yeah,
corner.
first, I just hope they don't diminish the walking groups. Like in Muses, they got great walking groups in that.
Yeah.
And to take that away, there's a new era of walking groups, and so you got to be careful about getting rid of those. Okay. All right. On December 5th, 1919, 100 years ago yesterday, a guy by the name of Lyle Saxon, who's a writer, wrote this in the Times-Picayune. He says, "There's a pall over the city. Eyes are filled with tears and hearts are heavy. Old memories tucked away in the dusty cobwebs of forgotten years have come out like ghosts to dance in the last ghastly ballet of flame. The heart of the old French Quarter has stopped beating.
And we're looking at it right now.
And he was referring to the French Opera House, which that was taken the day earlier on December 4th, 1919, which was destroyed by a fire. It had been built 50 years earlier, and New Orleans had the first opera house in the nation. It was not that one; it was another place, but there was a big ballet tradition, and this was something that they were very proud of in New Orleans. And it caught fire.
And where was it located?
It was located on Bourbon Street in Toulouse. There's a motel there now. At first it was a downtown there, and now it's a four-point Sheraton. And if you walk by there, if you look at the curb, they still have the curb cuts that were built there for the carriages for people who are gone. And so it was a big loss to the city. It was like 8 stories high and just an incredible building. They bragged about how it was built in seven months, which was incredible. Now, there are some people who say, well, maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe they built it too fast, and maybe there was a little bit of sloppy work from here to there, and there are some people who are critical of the construction, but it just something that they just really tagged at the city. Okay, so this happens in 1919, so on the edge of 1920. In 1930, the Municipal Auditorium opened, and my own theory is that the Municipal Auditorium was the result of the French Opera House burning, because it would have taken 10 years to get together civically and says, let's do something and let's build a municipal place. But it was part of the city's history, and if you go into the quarter, you should pass by that block, and I think that the hotel has some photos and some exhibits about the Opera House.
Thanks a lot. It's time now to look ahead.
Okay, this is the weekend every year when you hear a cliche that drives me nuts, okay? And the cliche is this. They're the masters of their own destiny. And the references to all the football teams that are trying for playoff positions and the Saints, we're going to hear that. You don't master your destiny. If you master it, it's not your destiny, okay? And so this is the weekend, so just watch out for that.
Okay, we will.
All eyes in Algiers Point right now are looking at the Canal Street Ferry. And when is it going to be back in service? We're told that by the end of the year, there should be a boat in the water. That's what we're looking forward to in the next couple of weeks.
All right.
Tomorrow downtown is the annual Christmas parade that has grown bigger and bigger every single year. It kicks off at 1 o'clock.
All righty. Mark?
Well, there's been a real conspicuous lack of progress in doing anything with the collapsed Hard Rock Hotel. There's some reasons for that, and anyone who's anticipating seeing some activity, there are some legal complications. There are conflicting legal interests among the parties, owner, the contractor, architect, and the city, and who's going to pay for this, either demolition or implosion, still to be determined. So look for that too. Probably the next news will be that it's going to be delayed even more than it already is.
All right. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.